A Chinese speaker is on the outside of a room, and a non-Chinese English speaker is on the inside of the room. And the Chinese speaker passes a sentence written in Chinese characters through like a slot in the door. The English speaker picks it up, looks at it, has no idea what it says. But the English speaker inside the room has a instruction manual or some sort of manual that they can look up exactly the phrase. It's very long. They can look up this exact phrase, and they can see the appropriate response in characters. Again, they have no idea what the characters mean, but they can write out the appropriate response, pass that back through the door, and the Chinese speaker on the other side picks it up, reads it, and would believe that a person inside the room can speak Chinese. And so the question becomes, is that what an artificial intelligence is doing, essentially, who we've taught appropriate responses? Welcome, Techno-Sapiens, to episode 241 of the Ink to Film podcast, where we read the book and then see the movie. I'm writer Luke Elliott.
And I'm filmmaker James Bailey.
And this week we discuss Alexander Weinstein's 2010 short story and Kogonada's 2022 film, After Yang. So, James, I have an admission I need to make to you.
What's that?
I have been a robot all along.
You're just a companion that was bought for me at some point?
Yeah.
So that I could understand film and literature culture?
Yeah, I was purchased to be a companion to talk to you about books, which I read but don't actually understand. I just mimic things. Yeah, that's kind of what this story is all about. AI and what it means to be a person and what it means to be sentient. And I find these topics super fascinating. I have a short story out in Reckoning 6 that is a lot about AI and what it means to be a person. So I found myself thinking about that in my story a lot when I was watching this one and reading this short story. So pretty cool, honestly. This is definitely my shit, and I found this whole thing to be really interesting.
I was thinking about that too, because I went to that reading that you did of your story, and our conversations of AI go back to like Blade Runner and Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep, which was like 2017 for this podcast.
Yeah.
And I feel like we've always found a way to sort of navigate the topic because each time the story is exploring something different. But this one really is, it's not as much about the perspective of the AI. It's more about what humans are perceiving it as. And I don't know, it's just this really beautiful story about how like we can see existence in things that we've created, but this story is like introspective. Like it's a human sort of thinking about what humanity means, and it's a human who I would argue is kind of struggling with being tethered to the world and what it means to be alive on his own, and then seeing that reflected in what he perceives sometimes as a machine, and just the way that like these AI and like virtual assistants and all of these things, like where the line is drawn when existence and humanity end and begin, kind of. Yeah,
the short story and the movie, I would argue, handle it a little bit differently and have like a little bit different of a focus. When you're talking about like the perspective of the AI, I think you get more of that in the movie, and that is expanded on, partly because, you're trying to fill a 1.5 hour movie, so you kind of have to, but it does change the focus a little bit because the short story, as you said, is much more tied to the human perspective. That ends up changing the message a little bit. So that's something that we can sort of dive into for each. For this coverage, we're going to talk about the short story first, as we usually do, and then we'll move into the movie. The short story follows, well, I guess the film follows the short story somewhat. There's some pretty major changes, but describing the short story will be a pretty good spoiler for the movie. So it's difficult for us to talk about this in a very spoiler-free way. So I guess the only real talk we have about it that's completely spoiler-free would be right now. So what were your general thoughts, I guess, on both?
I think that this story has a great premise because it is it's that different perspective on AI that we haven't seen explored in this way. And I think we've seen, you think of like a Deckard, who is like seemingly a human perspective.
Talking about Blade Runner or Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep?
Right, and the way that he's interacting with the world. But this is something much more like in the home, and it feels more like relatable, and it feels more like something you could see happening in the near future.
The future of this story and the movie to an extent as well, it feels quite attainable. It feels like this might be where we're headed. And in fact, I would say it is also kind of a utopian concept of future, especially in the movie.
Yeah, and I like that idea that we can find a way to these things that we're so worried about, giving away privacies and allowing these devices in our home, which I think the movie touches back in on that worry of giving up these privacies and allowing these devices created by corporations in your home. But just the way that the story is like internal, and I could see it being very useful to have an assistant, or really another person in the family who you can like sort of, I don't know, it feels weird when you're buying somebody like this, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Oh, I mean, absolutely. That's like the core question is Yang a person? And if he is a person, then his existence is sort of inherently slavery, right? Like the family has purchased him for a purpose. And even if he sort of enjoys his role, it's messed up. Now, honestly, the story that's not really what the story's about, but that is that's one of the many questions I think that gets raised.
Yeah.
As we try and decide for ourselves, is this a person?
Yeah. And within the story, I just love the way that it progresses, right? Like we get this scene where something happens and then Yang needs to be repaired. And then along the way, we see what someone would normally perceive as going to get a computer or device fixed.
Yeah.
And the way that sort of changes over the course of the story, I thought was really, really ingenious.
Yeah, that's like kind of a satirical element that is present in the story that is also present in the movie, but I think it's because of its, I guess, page time, maybe a little more prominent in the story. There's sort of a satire going on here too, like a little bit of skewering of modern society, or yeah, I don't know. Like, this isn't a spoiler, but like the main character in the short story works at a Whole Foods, and his wife works at a Crate and Barrel, and they're both like white liberals too, which has changed a little bit for the movie. So this feels like it's poking fun a little bit, right?
Yeah. Well, there was a little bit of that too. With their reasoning for wanting to adopt a Chinese child was like to add some diversity to their lives, and they were so privileged in their upbringing and everything. They wanted to like sort of give back, and I was like, whoa.
They don't want to actually like teach the kid anything about Chinese culture, so they bring in this assistant to do so. That's sort of the premise of the story, right? They've brought in this assistant AI called Yang, who is from this, I think it's called Big Brothers or something, Brothers and Sisters, that is designed to teach culture, which is inherently kind of absurd, right? But designed to teach culture to their daughter, who is an adopted daughter herself. There's also this really interesting thing where it's played against the idea of cloning, because cloning seems to be the big thing that a lot of families are doing. We don't get that explored fully, but they are against it, it seems like, in this family.
I love the reasoning too. They go on to say like something about how they're not egocentric enough to want to clone themselves to be their own child. They wanted to sort of go elsewhere.
Right.
And that's a kind of an interesting commentary as well. And there's a few characters we meet along the way who sort of push back against that. We have the neighbor who has clones as children.
Yeah, the neighbor's a really interesting character, actually. Which I think that's starting to get into spoiler territory. So before we get into all of that, I guess I'll give my thoughts. I found this story to be reminiscent of a Ted Chiang story, perhaps. I didn't find the prose to be quite on his level. I don't, no insult to Weinstein, because few of us are. I found the prose to be very straightforward, though, and approachable. And the writing had a nice sort of satirical bent that reminded me a little bit of Saunders, which I read is one of his influences. But there was like a poignancy and an emotion behind it too that I've seen him compared to Emily St. John Mandel, which is another one we've covered on the podcast, and we both really liked. And I can see that comparison a little bit. I don't think I've read enough of her stuff to maybe make that jump. Like I've just read Station 11, and I didn't see a lot of Station 11 in this story, but, you know, they're very different subject matters. One of his big influences in an interview I watched for him was Charlie Kaufman, which is another favorite of the podcast.
Absolutely. Felt that influence for sure.
Yeah, so it's really cool to see the connections to all these different things. And then I kept thinking about Philip K. Dick, who we've already mentioned with Blade Runner, and how it's a short story being turned into a movie that honestly is fairly different, but at the core about the same thing, much like Blade Runner. So even though the sort of genre is slightly different, it's interesting to think of him that way too. You know, I was recently at Worldcon in Chicago, and the topic of adaptations was something we discussed, and it had me thinking about how different it is to adapt a novel versus a short story, and to take a novel and compress it into a movie versus take a short story and expand it into a movie, right? And how you're going to get two very different results, and there's a different amount of space for the director to come in and really try something different. And here we get that expansion effect for the movie, which, real quick, I found to be beautiful. I have a few quibbles and criticisms of it that I think hold it back a little bit. But overall, you know, I enjoyed watching it. It is a very melancholy film. Yeah, I guess you need to be in the right mood to watch it, be ready for like a melancholy exploration of humanity and what it means to be human, and that's my shit. Like, I love that, but even still, I found the tone to be kind of one note after an initial. We'll get into it, but like it did something interesting early, and then it kind of shifted into this like melancholy tone that just stayed throughout the rest of the movie. And like, even though I'm someone who loves that, and I feel like I'm the target audience, I still found it to be a little one note. So again, I have some criticisms of it, but overall, A24 film, very interesting, well made, beautiful. There's a lot to like here. So it would ultimately be a movie I recommend, a short story I recommend. It's, you know, they have slightly different goals, and I think this is one where you would definitely be safe to read the short story first, even though it kind of spoils the movie. The movie's very different, so I think you could go into the movie and still really enjoy yourself and not worry about spoilers.
Just to talk about the movie a little bit, I was blown away. I think the big stopping point for people on this film would be just that it is, even with the shorter length that it has, it is very intentionally slow.
Yeah.
And I think that is something that you said, you have to be in the right mood for it. And I'll admit, when I first started it, I don't know that I was in the right mood for it, but at some point I like gave myself over to it. It does change the messaging of the story some. I thought it was shot brilliantly. It's striking, and I found myself looking at a lot of the lighting choices with like natural lighting, and there were like warmer colors in the home, which made it feel more welcoming. And just there are some like aspect ratio things that I got nerdy about when like memories were being thought of, and like some softer looks, and even when they're using like communication devices, it's not super clear right away because of the way that they're shooting it, but I kind of appreciated it for that. Like, it took me a second some of the time. But it's just a lot of really cool techniques, and in learning about the filmmaker, I learned that Yasujiro Ozu, probably one of the most influential Japanese filmmakers ever, is like a big influence, and he's also known for his very slow-paced films that are very introspective, and they're asking you to sort of dig into what's being shown before you. And Kogonada is a video essayist, basically, who has become a filmmaker as well, and really always was a filmmaker. But some of his stuff you've probably seen if you watch a lot of like film essays, which I know both of us do. He actually, in like some of the courses that I teach in and stuff, like his material has been used just to show. I know there's a really famous one about Wes Anderson and Symmetry. Like, he does a lot of editing, and it's really cool. I watched an Ozu one that he released, and just showing the styles of a filmmaker that like make them memorable and make them different from other people, and showing them off, not even necessarily by narrating it or anything like that. Some of the time he does do that, but there are other times where he just sort of lets the scenes play out and is highlighting these things.
Wow. So he's still releasing video essays.
I think so, but well, I mean, I'll get into it a little bit, but what's really cool is that he started out doing the essays on his own, online, releasing them. I think he was pursuing a PhD in film, and then eventually he was contacted by like the British Film Institute, the Criterion Collection, Sight and Sound magazine, and they commissioned him to create videos about some famous films and things like that. Like a Criterion Collection, they have, if you're a member of the Criterion channel, they have little video essays basically all within that will talk about some of the films. And I know he's worked on a few of those. So to see someone like this, who's a student of film, in the way that I strive to be a student of film, to you know, understand the styles, understand what makes people memorable, and understand what you can do with film, and then to become a filmmaker, I think is just the coolest thing ever. I can't wait to talk more about this person, because he's just, I'm so impressed.
All right, so let's dive into the short story then. It sounds like we're ready. It will be somewhat spoilery for the movie. The short story is basically just about this family, right? We've already talked about, they bring in Yang, who is this assistant, and it opens with Yang malfunctioning and splashing his face into his cereal. And that's when we're first introduced to the idea of him being this technological being. And I think it's Mika and both, right? The daughter gets pulled away, and the father, whose name is Jake in the movie, I think it might be the same in the short story, but he might not be named, I'm not sure, is dealing with him and trying to figure out what's going on with him. And the whole story is basically him trying to get Yang repaired. He ends up going to a couple of different places. Quick Fix, which is the Geek Squad-esque style fixer-upper place. Yeah, I was getting big Best Buy vibes from it. The
order, though, is important, I think, because initially his neighbor, George, I believe, says, like, hey, take him to this guy, tell him you know me, and he'll give you, a break. It'll be like a third of the price.
Right, and he does that first in the short story.
And so he goes to, like, this mechanic, basically, like what you would think of. And in the short story, it's really interesting because he's kind of wrapped up in a lot of, like, conservative ideals.
Yeah.
And the way that there are, like, racist posters, I guess, or things that he's written that and then there's, like, guns and ammo and, like, all these magazines in the waiting room. And
yeah, he keeps thinking about how this isn't someone I would usually associate with. Yeah.
Right. And then eventually he goes to this Geek Squad-esque place, and he's like, I feel much more comfortable with their, like, buttoned up sort of, like, corporate, like, with a smile, service with a smile kind of thing, even though they're not able to necessarily do much. So
yeah, and they're going to charge him a lot more to do basically nothing. Same stuff basically for both. So ultimately he ends up deciding, even though he initially is resistant to it, he decides to bury Yang, but extract the voice box and have sort of a personal assistant style voice that his daughter can interact with at the end of the story. And the story basically ends with the daughter interacting with Yang and him thinking about how he doesn't really know anything about the world.
Well, and one of the major things here, too, is the neighbor, right? Like, he keeps thinking of this neighbor as sort of ridiculous. He paints his face for Super Bowl and sporting events, and he's, like, he has clone children, and he doesn't really see himself connecting with this person. But this person's clearly, like, going out of their way to,
continues to be more thoughtful than he gives him credit for, and respect Yang's position that Yang had in their family.
Right, and was sort of asking, was inquisitive, was caring, and then sent flowers at the end. And then it was a big deal that, like, he finally understood the neighbor in a sense and thought about, like, the existence and what it means to interact with these people. And then they put the flowers near Yang, who is now this, like, a virtual assistant. And he sort of, I like the last line is he thought about how he didn't know much about the world.
So the last line that you're referring to says, "Wow, that's amazing," Kyra says, and I stand next to her, looking at the flowers George sent, acknowledging how little I truly knew about this world. So Kyra is, I believe, his wife, and George is the neighbor. Yeah, so he's, like, realized that he doesn't know a lot, and I think he's embracing the unknown, and he's embracing the question. Not only about Yang, but also just about what he thinks he knows. I think just in general, his sort of perceptions and beliefs. So yeah, it's a again, I feel like a slightly different place than what we end on in the movie, which we can get to. But one thing that I kept thinking about with this story is the Chinese room thought experiment. Are you familiar with this thought experiment?
I think I just was exposed to it recently. We may have sent it back and forth to each other, but it's basically there's someone who only speaks Chinese. You're trapped in a room. The person on the other side of the door.
Yeah, well, I can explain how it is. It sounds like you have somewhat of an understanding of it.
Yeah.
This may have come up in another story or something we read. I was trying to remember if maybe it was even in The Story of Your Life. It might have been. Anyway, so because it's somewhat about language, but really it's about artificial intelligence. So first off, let's start with the Turing test. Everybody's sort of familiar with the Turing test, right? Like an artificial intelligence that is sufficiently advanced enough to convince a person that it is a person. That was the test proposed by this, I think his name's like
Alan Turing.
Alan Turing.
Yeah.
Back in the day, and this is something that his argument was the only reason we perceive people to be human is because of their behavior. So if the behavior is sufficient enough to convince us, then it doesn't matter whether or not they truly are, quote unquote, and that's sufficient. They are now essentially human. So the Chinese thought experiment is a more modern, not really a counter, but it's a separate argument that does kind of run counter. And the idea is that a Chinese speaker is on the outside of a room, and a non-Chinese English speaker is on the inside of the room. And the Chinese speaker passes a sentence written in Chinese characters through like a slot in the door. The English speaker picks it up, looks at it, has no idea what it says. But the English speaker inside the room has a instruction manual or some sort of manual that they can look up exactly the phrase. It's very long. They can look up this exact phrase, and they can see the appropriate response in characters. Again, they have no idea what the characters mean, but they can write out the appropriate response, pass that back through the door, and the Chinese speaker on the other side picks it up, reads it, and would believe that a person inside the room can speak Chinese. And so the question becomes, is that what an artificial intelligence is doing, essentially, who we've taught appropriate responses? But the question is about what is understanding? What is the threshold at which we would say the person inside the room now understands Chinese? If they functionally are able to respond. This is kind of an impossible scenario because they would have to have an infinite number of responses, but say they do, or a sufficient amount, right? Can you say that the person inside ever truly understands Chinese if all they're ever doing is sort of mechanically looking up the response and sending it out?
Right. I think that is a good example of for me, I think of that and I'm like, no. But there is a threshold that at some point, if you do that long enough, maybe you do start to pick up on some of what's happening there, and it eventually can develop into understanding Chinese. You know what I mean?
And that's why I think it's the thought experiment specifically says, and I maybe should have said this, you're in a blank room. You have no interaction with the person outside. So all you're getting is characters and spitting out characters. There is no other stimulus. And that's important because I think that takes away the potential for the person to ever truly learn understanding, right? Because if you had context clues, if you could see the person, then you could start to say like, oh, because this is how we learn language, right? You see what they want and you can say like, oh, okay, they seem to be dealing with this object that I don't have a name for, but they're, it seems like this symbol refers to that. So
right.
You start to learn.
To relate it to AI, I just think at some point, the development of regurgitating these commands that we've programmed them with. At some point, if they do understand and truly can understand Chinese, or in this case, understand emotions, or like functionally understand what it means to, be alive and to sort of respond. I guess it's harder to relate it to AI when you start thinking of it like that. But my question is just like, how long does this go on for? Because if it goes on forever, you would think at some point some pieces and parts would be able to be deciphered just based on repetition or something, or guesswork. You know what I mean? And at some point that guesswork could become knowledge.
I mean, maybe. I guess if you don't have any true interaction with the other person, though, you have nothing to base it on. All you're doing is spitting that. I don't know how you could actually learn anything from that. But regardless, okay, so the point of this thought experiment is to try and say, like, that entity, that person inside the room, is not ever actually conscious of what they're doing, right? And so the argument then being artificial intelligence, if this is what it is not actually a person. It's not actually truly intelligent in the way that humans are. However, the counter argument to that is our brains essentially do this. And what makes it different, right? Like, our brains, all they are doing is taking in inputs and spitting out outputs. It's a complex system. It is. I've seen it described as like our brains are both the room itself and the person inside. It's not separate, because like a part of our brain doesn't understand English. Our whole brain as a system understands and responds to English. I don't know how accurate that is as far as neuroscience, but like, there's not like a separate entity that understands language. All it is everything we've learned up to this point, spitting back out the language that we quote unquote understand, even though we're just responding to stimulus in the same way. So yeah, it's an interesting thought experiment, right? And that's why it's proposed. And then there's one other one that I wanted to talk about, and this guy named Lycan, I believe, who proposes a artificial being named Harry, I think it was, who is indiscernible from a biological, human, who the only difference being, made up of mechanical parts and bleeds motor oil, that kind of stuff. But that being, has hopes and dreams, has emotions, has thoughts and feelings, goes to work, has a problem drinking, all this different stuff, struggles with, life at home, all the person foibles and difficulties that we understand. And the question is, once you learn that being, Harry, has motor oil for blood, does that somehow make him not a person, right? To us, do we look at that and say, okay, that's not a person, even though everything else is ostensibly the same?
I think that's what this story is sort of getting at as well. Yeah, that's closer to what's going on here, and I think that it depends on perception. It depends on what you consider to be. First of all, a person is different than like life, I would say. Like, would you consider it to be like independently?
So you're saying like sentience versus being alive. So sentience is another big question. What does it mean to be sentient? At what point are animals considered sentient versus not? Like insects, is a beetle sentient? Is a dog sentient? Is an ape sentient?
I was thinking about this too with this story, is like this void that's left behind by whatever family member, even if it's this pet. Or a pet, or like in this case, it's not a pet, but a sort of assistant AI, and that like grief that's left behind. But I think we should touch back on that in a little bit, because if you're feeling that grief, aren't you feeling the void left behind by something that was alive or independently interacting with the world?
Is that something that is just passing the Turing test?
Right.
Has it convinced you that it's a person, even though it's not? So, and I think that's the question that's being raised, right? Ultimately by this story. Some people, especially if you are a person with a religious belief, and if you're listening to this, you might be yelling this at us, would bring up the idea of a soul and say, well, we have souls. People have souls. That's what's different about us. So, setting aside the question of whether or not there is a God and like if that's a real thing, if there was a God who imbued humans with souls at some point in their development, maybe from the jump, you might argue, why couldn't that God imbue an artificial being with a soul? There's nothing stopping him from doing that. So the soul argument doesn't hold up, even if you grant that maybe it's real. There's nothing that says that Yang, for example, in this, wouldn't have been imbued with a soul from God. So ultimately, I don't think that necessarily answers the question either.
Yeah. I mean, my personal outlook on it is I'm more open to these machines eventually developing to the point that it's indiscernible and them being considered people. But I do think that there is like obviously a logical puzzle that has to be figured out before then. Like it's like for example, if Amazon creates some indiscernible artificial intelligence that they then put into a body that also you cannot tell the difference between the human body and this created body. At what point is it, like you said, inputs being put in by a company, and at what point does it actually bend the expectations to the point that it is self-thinking and and I think that that's one of the major things for me is like when an entity is able to, of course, have free thought. Like the free thought thing is hard to obviously nail down, but when it does have free thought, what like governance system is it still being controlled by, you know? Like at some point, like how do we know that it's fully disconnected from the network and not like still just a part of this larger entity?
Well, you've brought up ethical concerns, right? Like,
yeah,
at what point do we need to consider them human? This is, I think, a real question that we're going to, I think, in our lifetimes, see discussed on the floor of like Congress, right? Like people talking about, okay, we're getting these more and more advanced AIs. At what point do we need to start granting them legal rights?
I think it's going to be messy too. I think that it's going to be a longer period of time before they get rights than the rational thinking person will feel like is correct or right or, you know, morally the right thing to do. Because historically, like people have the entities have to fight for rights for a long time to be considered, you know, on the same level. So it's going to be a difficult struggle, I think.
You look back at human history and there's been many sorts of things that people have used to dehumanize and to say, this is not a real person and therefore doesn't deserve rights, right? We've seen this time and time again. And yeah, I agree. Usually there's a lag before we sort of catch up to that. And I think that absolutely is going to be here. And in fact, I mean, this is rife for science fiction writers, right? And in fact, I think it's going to maybe be even more of a hurdle because of how different AI at least begin, and the fact that we create them. And I think that is something that I find very interesting too. Like, we imbue them with this quote unquote life and sentience. So at what point are we willing to admit that we are capable of creating life in that way, a sentient life?
And as I said, like I'm more open to considering these machines and these entities to be people sooner, I think, than most. But the thing that's scary is who created ultimately the AI and what their lean was. Because what if, I think humans, there's something about humans and humanity that there is this sort of urge to do the right thing, or at least, you know, morally the right and wrong thing, and just the capability and the possibilities of what something like this could potentially do, especially if not programmed to think with that directive. What's the directive called, where it's sort of like for the greater good?
Yeah, there's I think you're talking about, I want to say it's Asimov had these like three laws of robotics.
Mm-hmm. There's some like there's some rules that have to be put into place to ensure, because ultimately, like, when these beings are up and running and fully capable and can replicate themselves, we will be basically at the mercy, and I think that's the biggest fear for people, will be at the mercy of these things that we've created, because they'll be infinitely smarter, infinitely more powerful, you know.
I just looked it up. It is Isaac Asimov. He proposed the 3 laws of robotics, which are: 1, a robot may not injure a human being or through an action allow a human being to come to harm. 2, a robot must obey orders given to it by human beings, except where such orders would conflict with the first law. And 3, a robot must protect its own existence as long as such protection does not conflict with the first or second law. So this is his proposed laws of robotics to sort of fight against what we're talking about.
I think it's a smart starting place, but the rules still don't. So if a robot has been purchased or whatever and now we're talking about robots, this isn't even necessarily the same exact thing, but it kind of is. So say you purchase it and you happen to also be a serial killer, and someone's chasing after you and attempting to subdue you or kill you or whatever, because that's what we've, you know, the policing of humanity is like something that like finding finding the darkness and trying to like snuff that out. Maybe not necessarily killing, but capturing and all of that. Within that, it says that by inaction, no human can come to harm by this robot's inaction. So it's like you're effectively creating bodyguards for evil people also.
Yeah. Oh, I see what you're saying. Yeah, potentially. It's complicated and it's a big question. And honestly, I think we can't get into it fully because we have stuff to talk about and we probably need to move on. But I just wanted to like put those all on the table and maybe we can touch back in on them as we go through the story and the film, which I think both are touching on it. And specifically, I don't know for sure, but I suspect that the reason Mika is Chinese, at least partially, might have to do with this Chinese room thought experiment. Because the question of the thought experiment is, does the person know Chinese? Is the person essentially Chinese? And that becomes a big question in the movie as well for Yang. Like, is Yang Chinese? And that's like another side of this thought experiment that's very interesting.
Well, because it goes beyond what it means to be alive, and it goes to what it means to be Asian specifically. So it's like, even if Yang was created in Asia and given all of these cultural knowledge points, there's a point that's made about the tea at some point in the film. We'll get to that. But this idea of like understanding everything about the tea, but not being able to appreciate it in the same way a human can.
Right. Which is sensory. I had a big question in the movie about whether or not Yang can taste and can... What senses does Yang have?
Yeah.
I was unclear.
And I think it's intentionally left open-ended, right? Like that was a smart decision in my opinion.
So I just want to say, for me, this is a question I find endlessly fascinating, and my position on it, I think, does shift and morph over time as I'm presented with new data, because I'm not someone who tends to lock in a belief and not leave it open to interrogation. But I feel like we ourselves, as people, are biological machines with brains that are complex computers able to regard self, to learn and feel emotion and, experience reality through our senses. If there was a machine built to do those same things, to me, that is an equal being of sentience, regardless of anything else. Because I don't think there's anything particularly special about us other than the fact that we're rare, as far as we know. I don't believe that humans are somehow like magical, and there's something that makes our biology inherently superior to the mechanics and electricity and programming of a machine.
Do you know what it is for me? And I agree with you on that point. And I was just thinking of something that would be the threshold for me as well. Is you mentioned that we're basically computers and we can do all of these fascinating things and we have all this inherently built into our systems. What the AI would need to hit is that incredibly complex minutia of like, we can feel all these different emotions. Yes, they're not, but it's not like a binary thing. It's not just like anger. There can be this anger mixed with this, and it's this variation in the way that all of these things come together in a really complicated way that I don't think we even can get close to technologically creating yet. That I think will be the sort of threshold to where it becomes the exact same to me, is when technology gets to the point that we can replicate how complex our bodies are.
Sure, but you could also argue, babies. You could argue people with severe mental disabilities, who maybe can't experience things in the same way. Babies who have not matured. We still consider them to be people. Yeah,
that's just considering emotions though. But what I'm speaking of also is just like your body on its own is doing incredibly, like, just like you think of at the cellular level, like how many crazy things are happening. And
but does that by definition, is it your cells that make you a person?
No. But I just mean the processes, the number of the millions and millions of processes, the synapse firing in your brain, like all of those.
I agree. People are incredibly complex and amazingly beyond even our understanding in some ways of like how complex a human being is. However, I don't know that complexity isn't required for sentience.
For them to be considered the exact same as us, I would say. Because, like,
yeah, well, I guess we're talking about two different things, right?
Yeah.
Being considered exactly the same, but also, like, we grant rights to, like, animals, right? Like, no one say a dog is the same as a person, but there are laws against someone just going around and murdering all the dogs they see, because we say that, you know, these are, you know, this gets into, like, veganism and stuff. You could argue about cows and all the other things that we do kill, but, like, this is a big question. Like, what kind of rights do these intelligences deserve?
Yeah, and with a lot of animals, I think it has to do with the level of emotional understanding too.
Right.
Like,
but doesn't it feel like such an arbitrary?
It does, yeah.
Yeah, that's why, like, I feel like if I was stronger in my convictions, I would be a vegan. I'm just not. I don't know.
I mean, we talk about how intelligent and, like, emotional octopi are.
Yeah. Now you're touching on stuff I like. This is a big part of my book that I've been writing. Cephalopods.
It seems arbitrary for sure when we just sort of handpick this and that. Why not arbitrarily consider at some point machines or AI to also be, you know, worthy of protection?
Yeah, and at some point we will have to make that decision. And yeah, this story is maybe proposing a future where it's gone past the point where it probably should have been done, especially in the movie. So, a little bit before we leave the story behind, because I do want to talk about the film. What do you want to talk about with the story that really stood out to you?
I think, like I mentioned, one of the things to me that stands out is it does sort of start with this comedic, like, sort of what if premise where it's like, what if your Alexa broke, but it was, like, more complex and it was able to do all these things and you had to take it to be fixed. But then by the end,
and your kid considered it a sibling,
right? And then by the end, you are understanding more emotionally, like, what this thing, whether you believe it's a person or a thing, meant to your life in a way. And so at some point it doesn't even matter anymore that whether you think it is or is not. It's because it's, like, how you're perceiving it. If you perceive it as something that's important to your life and it's changed the life of maybe your child or you in general, like, these things you can create. I don't know, like, I use my AirPods every day. I feel like I have, like, an emotional attachment to my AirPods because they provide something that helps my everyday life.
But if they broke, would you give them a funeral?
No, and that's the point, right? But at what point would you? You know, where?
Yeah. No, I think I totally agree. This story is all about the meaning that humans give to things, right? Like, our ability to fall in love and to grant personhood to all kinds of stuff is well documented, right? This is something that we have seen time and again people do, and that's kind of what is happening here. But the contra to that is repeatedly proposed, because that seems cold, right? That seems like we shouldn't do this. These things are not people. However, the story is also saying, like, we don't understand what people really are. We have a very limited understanding of our reality. We can't even understand other human beings because we make judgments about them, the neighbor George being an example here. And so ultimately our main character comes back around to, like, we're going to give Yang a funeral and we're going to recognize how important he was to our lives. And then there's this, like, weird resurrection that happens where we see the voice box extracted and Mika conversing with Yang at the end. And I had a million questions. Does this version of Yang have all of Yang's memories? Is this Yang's mind intact, or is it just an Alexa now style machine that can respond but has no memory and has no personality?
I mean, it's a good question. Like, I took it to be the former. Like, I took it to be Yang this whole time. This idea of, because it looked like something we perceive as a person, you were starting to think of it as a person, and that the question that's being asked here at the end, if everything's the exact same and then it just becomes a thing that sits on the table and speaks to you, is that the same thing? And
is that also a person? Yeah, now that it has no body. These are all big questions, and I love that this story is sort of asking all these questions and then admitting sort of a lack of understanding and saying, like, that's what we should ultimately take away, is that we don't know, and be willing to keep our minds open to it.
And something that's picked up more in the film, but something that is sort of the groundwork is laid here, was Yang was doing things that they couldn't necessarily understand or explain, like the bugs. He was sort of collecting bugs.
Baseball glove taken home from the game.
Right.
Or at least the people observing it didn't understand it. Maybe Yang did have some sort of understanding of what he was doing.
Well, the bug, like I think, is he's sort of looking at these shells, right? They're dead bugs, and he's looking at them in a way that he's like, "What am I when I'm no longer here?" And just like these bugs, like something is left behind.
Yeah. Well, that becomes a thing in the movie for sure. That's less clear in the story, and that's the thing. The story's 20 pages long. It's one of the shortest, I think, short stories we've read, or at least it moved really quickly for me. And because of that, like a lot of the stuff is sort of asked beyond the page. It's like, it's up to the reader how much of this stuff they want to engage with, and the story doesn't provide a lot of answers to these questions. So ultimately, like, shout out to Weinstein here. I think this is a really interesting story. It's talking about a lot of stuff that I like to talk about, at least especially with that story in Reckoning. And it proposes a lot of fascinating questions, and I think it's really cool that it got made into a movie.
I agree. I was really happy I read it. It flew by. I didn't feel like there was any. I was really sucked into it. It's one of those stories where it's got this really fun premise. It's still interacting with AI, which is a subject that we both like, but in a way that felt unique, in a way that felt different, and was asking different questions. So I appreciated it for that reason. And then, yes, getting to the movie, there's a lot to love here for me. So I'll start with the filmmaker because we've already talked about him a little bit, but I just am really fascinated by this person. So this film, After Yang, was written, directed, and edited by Kogonada. He's a South Korean-born American filmmaker. He is known for his video essays that analyze the content, form, and structure of various films and television series. The essays frequently use narration and editing as lenses, and often highlight a director's aesthetic. Kogonada, the name is a pseudonym, is a regular contributor to Sight and Sound magazine and is frequently commissioned by the Criterion Collection to create supplemental videos for its home video releases. He's also written and directed a film called Columbus that came out in 2017. His identity is nearly unknown. So he attends his screenings, he attends marketing for them and everything like that, but I think I found his name. I wasn't looking super hard, but I don't want to reveal it just because I think there's a reason that Kogonada has done this, and there's a lot wrapped up in this identity thing here that I was reading. He says that it's a moniker taken from Kogonada, a frequent screenwriter of Yasujiro Ozu, who I was mentioning before. So this person was a frequent collaborator, and he screenwrote a lot of Ozu's films. In a 2018 interview with the Financial Times, he stated, "If I'm honest, the pseudonym was about being an Asian American too. There is something about being an immigrant in America and having the power to name yourself." He immigrated from South Korea as a child and was raised in Indiana and Chicago. As of 2022, he resides in LA.
So I wanted to mention a friend of mine, Monte Lin, has a short story called Unnamed that appears in Cast of Wonders, which is an audio magazine. You can listen to this story. And it talks a lot about this idea of names, the way they tie you to your culture and being Asian American. So if you would like to explore more of that, I would recommend that, and I will link it in the show notes. He would have been a good person to have on this episode had I known that that's what this was all about. Right. The problem is I didn't know that.
Well, Kogonada also explained to Filmmaker magazine he likes Chris Marker's idea about your work being your work. That's part of the reason why for the pseudonym. And he said, "I've also never identified much with my American name, which always feels a little strange to see or hear, and I'm quite fond of heteronyms." So I wanted to talk about Kogonada's video essays because I love this kind of stuff. This is some of my favorite stuff on the internet, just seeing how artistic minds interpret other people's work. And I just think that it's always useful to me. I always feel that it gives me a new perspective. And I wanted to talk about this. His video essay work typically showcases a particular theme or aesthetic that I mentioned. Some examples of these are his videos on American director Wes Anderson, who's known for using unusually symmetrical framing in his films. So this is one of the ones I was talking about. He sort of draws dividing lines throughout the frames and shows just how precise these can be and what it's conveying and why he's doing it. Because I think people like that sort of dollhouse look and they like that symmetry, but they don't necessarily understand the reasoning behind it. So I found those essays to be really interesting, and that takes the idea of a filmmaker being responsible for everything in the frame and everything having a meaning to a different level and having it develop and become a style. Because it's one thing to say this is how I want the audience to feel, and it's another thing to be recognizable for the ways that you can use a certain technique to evoke different emotions repeatedly. So I think that's always something cool to check out. His video essays are formed through the juxtaposition of images conveying thoughts through a particular arrangement of clips. In an interview with Nashville Scene in March 2015, Kogonada likened creating video essays with preparing sushi. With sushi, every cut matters, and so do the ingredients. Those two ongoing choices are the difference, what you select and how you cut it. In comparing written essays with visual essays, Kogonada noted how words form precise observations of ideas, while visuals can convey a particular idea without providing a definite explanation. He explained that if you want to delve deep into theory, texts are the perfect medium. However, I'm making visual essays. I treat words as supplementary.
That's cool. I really like that. And that deals with like the difference in medium, right? That we talk about all the time.
Yeah.
And the idea of like a video essay versus a written essay is not something I had fully thought about, but he's totally right. Like there is, especially like the less the, voiceover tells us, and the more we're just left with what we're seeing, we're left to interpret our own things.
Yeah. And I think it can be difficult early on. I actually, funny enough, saw that he was saying when he first watched an Ozu film, he kind of bristled against it because it was slow and it didn't make a lot of sense to him. And then later on, he understood more of the language of film and understood what Ozu was doing, and clearly has taken a lot from him as his style sort of is reminiscent. And then he also, his name even is sort of a reference to Ozu.
That's really cool.
I also was looking into like how he got started and how he started doing these videos, and he said part of it was desperation to create something out of the material of this form that I loved. At the time, I was doing a film studies PhD, but trying to express things in the academic idiom was really a struggle. When I allowed myself to re-enter the world of images, like in editing, that came a lot easier to me. I am sort of obsessive. I was raised to pay attention to forms. I'd have conversations with my father about the form of things. He would have me look at rocks and branches a certain way.
No, I like that. And that plays into the conversation they had about tea in this movie, which I was probably the high point of the movie for me. There was a couple of really good moments like this. But I really love this because you can take it to be a discussion about so many other things. Not only the nature of what it means to be human and to experience things and understand them fully and connect with them on an emotional level, but yeah, just like the idea, like as someone who's really into whiskey, I kept thinking about that, and I kept thinking about beer, right? Like in different consumables, much like tea, where there is like a craftsmanship to them, and there is a surface level appreciation, and then there's like if you want to get geeky about it, you can get into the terroir, and you can get into the all the little components and the emotions and the subjectivity of your taste and all this stuff. And I kept thinking about that when he was talking about tea, but then you can extrapolate it out to what you're talking about, right? Like appreciating art and appreciating movies and appreciating books, and how there is a superficial understanding of it, and then there's like the deeper, like people who devote their lives to really delving into these things and trying to understand every little nuance of meaning, and how maybe both are valid, but these are also quite different experiences that people can have with the same product.
You're interacting with something larger than yourself, right? The history of something like whiskey or tea or beer, like people have been doing this forever, and the way that like history feels when you interact with it and can touch it in that way.
Wine, tea, for some reason it seems to have a drug in it. That seems to be the ones we're really interested in.
This idea that he also talks about here with a desperation to create something out of the material that he loves. Like, I feel like that was part of the reason why I wanted to do a podcast about film that included film as well, right? Like that opportunity to express yourself and talk about and analyze these things in a different way. Like these video essays for him, I'm sure, are super formative for him to become the filmmaker he is today. And I feel like the podcast has been a similar kind of thing for me. It's just like a desperation to want to continue to talk about the form and like, a lot of the stylistic things that go along with the form of filmmaking.
Same. We both approach this podcast from a place of love, I think. Like we both love our art forms, and I think that love spills over into the other. Like, I also love movies in maybe a slightly different way, and you also love stories and novels, even though it maybe isn't your prime thing, right? But we both approached the podcast from that position, and you can look at this entire podcast as an act of love and devotion to our art forms. I think I like that.
Yeah, so let's move into the plot now. I'm going to read this I'll read half and then we'll kind of react to it. So Jake and Kira live with their adoptive daughter Mika and Yang, a previously owned robotic child they purchased from certified reseller Second Siblings, rather than from his original maker, Brother and Sisters Incorporated. When Yang becomes unresponsive, Jake goes on a mission to repair him. Brothers and Sisters recommend replacing Yang, which means his body will decompose. Not wanting to upset Mika, Jake becomes determined to save his robotic child. In a flashback, Yang reassures a curious Mika that she is still part of the family despite being adopted. Jake takes Yang to a cheap repairman named Russ, who discovers what he claims is a hidden camera inside of Yang. Jake takes the camera to a museum specialist named Cleo, who tells him that it is, in fact, Yang's memory bank. Jake goes home and watches Yang's memories. They include short clips from every day of Yang's life, including his time with a woman named Ada. The next day, Jake takes Yang to Cleo. In a flashback, Yang becomes sad about his inability to truly live.
Even that's kind of an interpretation,
right?
As we assume that what we're seeing is true. One thing I want to start with is the movie opens with this dance during the credit, like sort of opening credit roll. And the dance is wild. It's funny. We see Colin Farrell and, all of our actors just really getting into it. It's fun. It's all these different families. I was so excited. Like, I loved it, but I do think it kind of sets you up for like the wrong movie. Like, that's not what this movie is. And the whole movie after this is just this melancholy, slow, exploration of what it means to be a human and what it means to be Asian and all of that. And whereas this opening is very flashy and fun and has a lot of cutting, it is, and I would love to hear Kogonada talk about it because he's a video essayist and I'm sure he put a lot of thought into this. But like, why do this when to me it is kind of a complete 180 from what the rest of the movie is?
Yeah, I'm glad you brought this up because there's no way I wasn't going to talk about this. So I have my interpretation and then I'll read what I found about it. Okay. So my look at it after having finished the film is the family is still whole. Yang is still there. This is them enjoying their lives together. This is what it's like, and then that gets broken, and we have to deal with the grief and everything that comes from that, and that void that's been left behind. And it feels very human. Also, dancing is a very human thing to do, even though he does seem to be a little more robotic with his movements than everybody else. It just like goes to show that like he's doing this along with them, bonding with them, and that's sort of what I took away from it. And yeah, the everything that comes after is sort of in reaction to like the hole that's left behind. But I did read in some behind the scenes stuff that the global virtual dance-off sequence in the opening was inspired by Yasujiro Ozu's Early Summer from 1951 and Kid with the Golden Arm from 1979. Early Summer features a family that's really in sync in its earlier scenes as they're having breakfast and going about their daily chores. Then the rest of the film is about the disillusion of that family. According to himself, Kogonada always loved that idea of seeing a family in sync, so the dance scene was a literalization of that. Kid with the Golden Arm, on the other hand, a film Kogonada watched as a kid, has a title sequence in which every gang member in their metallic suits showed their specialty.
Huh. Yeah, I mean, I get that, and I see why he did it. I do think my sort of resistance to it stands. As much as I love it, I'm like,
yeah, the expectations, like you said,
it sets up a weird expectation for the movie you're going to get that this is not what you get. It's not because of the in-syncness, but because of how bright and fun and funny. Like, they're having these people do some ridiculous dances, and ultimately, I actually don't want this scene removed. I like the scene. And one of my criticisms of the movie overall, and it's a gentle criticism, is that I wanted more of a tonal variety. I wanted some more scenes where I could have fun. I wanted some more scenes that were reminiscent of this opening throughout. and I kind of missed the whimsy that this proposes at the beginning. And I understand it's more about the being in sync, but I did find the basically an hour and a half of melancholy to be a bit much. Seems like critics mostly like this movie, but there was some pushback, and I'm wondering if that's where it's coming from. Because I think if you're someone who thinks seriously about film and story, like, you're not going to watch this movie and think it's awful and think that the person making it was doing it as a cash grab or something. It's like, no, this is an A24 film. It's highly artistic, but in some ways maybe gets in its own way. And I think that's maybe what some of these critics are responding to.
I think that you'd be surprised by the scores, though. Like the critical scores are like in the 8s and the 80s and in those numbers.
Well, that makes sense to me. It's a good movie.
Yeah, it's the audiences who are a little bit lower because,
well, sure.
Again, it's throwing you for a loop. And I think, when I watch an A24 film, I'm also like really open to whatever is going to happen. And I think that like the expectation setting thing can definitely like be a stumbling block. But to me, it's more of like, I don't know, it's a starting point, and then we see this like falling out. And I do think there are a lot of A24 films that do have this sort of, not oppressive, but like a lot of emotional weight to them, where like this story is like slow moving, and there's not a lot of exciting or fun parts to it. And I think that's like, there are movies like that exist in A24. It didn't throw me off at all, and I appreciated the scene, but I can see where you're coming from.
Okay.
Yeah.
So let's talk more about what the changes that are introduced early here, right? Like the idea of Yang having memories is not really delved into in the story. We get this character Ada introduced, which I was quite surprised to see. We get a change up of the order. He goes to the Geek Squad style guys first, and then goes to his neighbor's recommendation second. And he takes Mika along for the ride and for a lot of this stuff, and that adds an emotional weight ultimately to the story, and that adds something that I thought was really interesting, right? Having her there to provide that perspective. And ultimately, I think that's necessary because, for whatever reason, Jake, to me, is a little flat. I really couldn't figure out how he felt. He would say things that would make me feel like, okay, he understands and he feels genuine emotion about Yang. But so often I felt like it was such a subdued performance by Colin Farrell, and whether that's him or the direction, I don't know. And I guess I just wanted a little more emotion so I could understand the character. Like, I feel like Jake is a character, as much as he's kind of the focus, I don't really know much about him, other than he seems to like tea, and it seems to be something that, like, he has this conversation with Yang, which again was like a high point of the movie because I felt like I finally connected with the character. But that far into the film, I still didn't really know anything about Jake. And to me, that was another slight stumbling block. It's like I wanted a little more. Like Yang is, I don't know, maybe it's set up to be like, by comparison to Yang, we're showing like a fairly flat affect person.
I think that's exactly what it is. That was going to be my perspective on it. Was we're seeing someone who isn't taking full advantage of living life and enjoying it and living it to the fullest, and then we see someone who wants and yearns for that but could never have it, almost like the as far as enjoying things like tea and that kind of thing.
It's depressing, man, because we're seeing this world that they create in the movie, I think brilliantly, just through like hints. The world building that's going on is a world where everything, all these self-driving cars, which I'm a big proponent of. We got it seems like there's been some engineering in these cities to make them more sustainable. We see trees growing on a bridge, for example, at one point.
Their home is incredibly cool too.
Their home's beautiful.
It's very nature's kind of a theme. There's a lot of plant life.
And yet it seems like there's this disconnect where all of the characters in this family seem depressed and seem disconnected. And a little bit of that happens before the dance. If there was no scene before the dance, that'd be one thing. But there is a brief scene where I feel like the conflict between Jake and his wife, which is it Kyra in the movie as well, is established, that there is some rockiness there. Basically, we're in reference to Yang and the role that Yang has in the family. So it seems like despite this utopian fairly society, there's still problems, and that makes for an interesting story, and that's cool to see that you can do that.
I think it's realistic too, right? Like even if our world was utopian, human nature is gonna. It's
depressing though, right? Like
yeah,
I don't know.
We can't escape it. We're not gonna be able to escape our baser instincts. I think like we're always gonna find something to, unfortunately, like focus on that might be more negative. Or
he gets to like have a tea shop where he gets to talk about the thing that he loves, but people, I guess, don't care.
Oh, definitely not.
People want this crystal tea that is like this artificial thing, and he wants to like keep the craft alive. It's interesting because the story was written in 2010. The movie comes out more recently, but like the appreciation of like craftsmanship and like that stuff is actually really hot right now. I feel like that's actually something people really like. So in certain circles, at least,
it's also like he seemed like he had that crystal tea in his store, but he was just out of it at the time. And the woman had no sort of empathy for that. She was like pissed off and like, oh, service.
I thought he didn't carry it. And then later on, he's like, I felt like he was just trying it for the first time when he has.
Oh, maybe I'm wrong. Okay. There's a little bit of context to the story that I wanted to give you, because I feel like there's tones of it, but I didn't get it until I saw in the behind the scenes. And apparently there's memorabilia on the bulletin board in Russ's repair shop that reveals that the story takes place after a 6-decade-long war between the U.S. and China.
Now that is referenced a little bit in the story. I don't know if it's specifically, but like there's this idea of like the Chinese adoption has something to do with the war, and like anti-Asian racism is a big problem, and it's something that we've been dealing with, and I feel like Kogonada has to be talking about the Asianness and the like. Is Yang Asian? Is Yang Chinese? What does it mean to be an American-born Asian American? Right, like for Mika, trying to connect to her culture. All of that, I think, is way more pronounced in the movie than it was in the story, which makes sense because ultimately the story is written by a white dude, Weinstein, and this to me feels like it's a lot more about that, which shifts the focus again a little bit away from the artificial intelligence, and that's one of the things. Let's get into it as we get into the end, but the difference in the ultimate message behind the story I found in the movie. Is there anything else from this first half that we want to talk about? Any other changes?
Well, he met with this the museum curator, and the way that she we in the story we get the sort of conservative mechanic, and then we get the buttoned up sort of corporate America guy.
Oh, which by the way, before I forget, there's a detail in the story where the neighbor drives a hybrid, and he says it as if the neighbor is driving like a Hummer.
Right.
And I just thought that was funny because it shows like the shifting in like, I guess the implication being that like a hybrid still uses gasoline and everybody else must drive electric now. But yeah, it's like, oh, he drives a hybrid, like I thought that was funny.
Yeah. And then we get this character who seems well-meaning and wants to explore what this AI means and wants to explore these techno sapiens.
Sapiens, yeah.
And, but is doing it in such an academic way that it's like removing any empathy from it. And I thought that was another really interesting character to add in. And the commentary that's being made there of museums, and the sort of gross history with that, and sort of taking a culture and putting it in a place for typically white people to experience. And then also just the way that you can be so invested in trying to learn the secrets and learn sort of some of this other stuff, you'll be too removed to understand the humanity of it. And I think there's something that's being talked about with like an AI sort of interacting with the world, and even us humans can be removed from emotion at times if it means understanding the knowledge.
Well, and I love that the question of the family's privacy is raised by the mechanic, But ultimately, we come back to the question of Yang's privacy and putting him on display in the museum. I like that that's dealt with. Like, ultimately, the decision is made to do so, but not to put the body on display, even though the memories are going to be there. And it's not all memories, it's only approved ones. I like the return to that and how it's complicated, right? It's not a complete refutation of it. It's not saying there's no value in this, because ultimately there is value in it. And I think Jake does recognize that. Now, his exploration of the memories, I wanted to shout out because I thought this was beautifully done. It looked like he was traveling through the universe and approaching these little galaxies or stars, each one itself a memory. And then he dives into it. And the idea of that there are each these little like 3-second clips, I don't know how much it holds up to like scrutiny as far as like, why would they ever design it this way? But I loved it as far as visually, right? Because it gave an opportunity for montages, exactly what Kogonada seems to be really good at. And it's these montages of disparate images that come together to create a feeling and to create meaning that we have to interpret, even though there's very little written or like there's very little dialogue usually in these scenes.
Some of this, I mean, like the comparisons have to be made, right? Like this feels a lot like in ways like a Black Mirror episode, in the ways that it, or like we talked about the Turing test, like Ex Machina came to mind. Another.
I mean, this is a rife subject for sci-fi. Right. There's lots of stories about artificial intelligence.
Yeah, but there's so each one sort of approaches it in a different way. I think the Ex Machina comes from a sort of tech standpoint, and then a lot of Black Mirror episodes are more like the horrors of what can be. And this can be there are angles of this story.
Yeah. Black Mirror and Ex Machina both have a darkness to them. And in Ex Machina, you don't know that that's what it's about, but ultimately it arrives there. And this is different in that regard. Right.
But there is a little bit of darkness to this, but it does seem like it's not the main focus of it. A bit of a horror, sort of corporate overlord kind of thing, if you wanted to look into like the conspiracy theory guy.
Yeah, but that's not like the focus of it ultimately. I feel like that's kind of set aside.
Yeah. I think the thing that also sets this film apart is just like that use of introspection and contemplation, and then these memories. And the way that you play with these, and there are Black Mirror episodes. Like the memory thing specifically reminds me of a Black Mirror episode.
There's a story apparently. I didn't read it, but I read in a description of this book, "Children of the New World" that we have that had this story in it. There's another story about a company that sells artificial memories, I think is what it was. So it seems like, and this is something I didn't talk a lot about Weinstein, but I did actually read an interview with him where he was talking about like what he writes, and the question was like, what do you call what you write? And he says he calls it speculative fiction, which I like as a term. It's sort of an umbrella term, because I guess he does occasionally write like magical realism, things like that. He teaches writing, and a lot of people refer to this more as like literature, like literary writing. But ultimately, I like that he embraced speculative, and he said that like that community has embraced him, even though it seems like his background is more academic and literary, like with the kind of reading that you would get in college. So I don't know. It's just fascinating to me that where he landed on that, and I like that he embraced it rather than pushing against it.
Well, the beginning of the story did feel very literary to me. Like as we started it, I was like, oh, a very literary feel, very realistic. And then, you know, there's a little bit of that satire to it, but something about like really tethering these stories to like our world.
I just love the blending, right? Like we see the George Saunders story we covered, like it's definitely blending with sci-fi. Like I like to see, I want to see these walls start to come down more and more, because I think they are fairly artificial, and
I think they are coming down too. My perspective on it is that that's definitely starting to become the case more. But getting back to these memories, I loved, like you said, it was a chance for Kogonada to use his montage powers, but also he got to play with like different filmic looks. Like you're getting like different, much softer, almost like through a screen look. And then you're getting like some ratio. He plays with like aspect ratios at times, and the way that he plays with the memories and like you said, the interpretation of some of them. There was one that was just like tragic that we're getting through Yang, because he like sort of, Jake over time like breaks into different portions of the memory And like he eventually goes into like the alpha, which we see that's the big twist, is that so much of he's lived other lives that we were unaware of, and he's much older and seemingly has gone through a lot more. But the just the tragedy of having done this, like whatever we think Jake and the family is going through, he's done that over and over and over. And just the tragedy of a person or
I
an
wish,
entity like Yang.
I want to know how old is Yang? How long is this? But these are all ultimately not that important questions. It's just like the technical side of me wants to understand.
Okay, so the second half here, Jake tracks down Ada, who is revealed to be a clone. She confirms Jake's suspicions that Yang had been in a relationship with her. Jake and Kira decide to move on, letting Yang decompose and donating his memories to the museum. In a flashback, Yang and Kira discuss the improbability of an afterlife. Jake talks to Yang's previous owner, Nancy, who mentions that Yang was not a new product. Jake discovers a setting on the back of the memory bank that unlocks more of Yang's memories. They reveal that Yang had lived an entire life before either Jake or Nancy owned him, one in which he developed a relationship with a young woman named Ada. The older Ada is revealed to have cared for the aging mother in Yang's first family. Ada later dies in a car accident. The younger Ada tells Jake that the person in Yang's memories was her great aunt. At night, Mika tells Jake that she does not want to say goodbye to Yang. Jake agrees, and Mika begins to sing a song previously heard in one of Yang's memories.
Okay, so let's unpack this, right? The big change, this previous life, where Yang connected with Ada, the original Ada, and we see he is there through the entire life of this child who grows into like an adult man. And it seems like a very similar relationship, right? Like he was a sibling, much in the way he is to Mika here. And then he's resold at some point, it seems. He at least goes to a new family. And then he again goes to a new family after that, is when we actually get to the family of the story. And it's unclear to me how much of the alpha life he actually remembers. I don't think he has a full memory of it, right? But it seems like maybe some sort of like lingering thing is why he approaches the new Ada.
Right.
But I didn't get the idea that he like fully remembered his previous life.
Agreed. I don't think he did. I think that there's some, and this gets into that idea of memories and human memories and the way that human memories are change and over time, and they can't be encapsulated like these memories have been. And so that was another interesting perspective, was seeing Jake relive a lot of these moments perfectly through Yang's memories rather than remembering them more vaguely.
I was going to ask you about that. So that was ultimately where I decided I landed as well. So in these flashback scenes, we get echoes. We get these moments where a line is given and then the line is given a second time, and it's a slightly different take. And I agree. I think what I was getting was, one is the memory, the imperfect human memory, and one is maybe the more perfect Yang memory, and we're seeing them overlap. But the thing is, it doesn't really make a ton of sense in the sense that you're supposed to only have these 3-second things. Like you shouldn't be able to get an entire memory like this in the setup that we've been given. I don't know if that's a plot hole or if the camera is magical in a sense, so we're able to experience Yang's memories even if the character isn't, who's like got the glasses on. I was unclear on that. But that, unless there's something else going on there that I'm missing. Was that your read of that? Like why we're getting that echoing?
Yeah, that double, and that was something where I felt like if audiences didn't pick up what was happening, that could have been frustrating for audiences as well. But yeah, that's exactly what I think was happening, was Jake was getting to relive a lot of his memories and have them like confirmed, and then also reaffirm like just how much this character meant. And it's also interesting to indicate which 3 seconds from these days are saved, because I think that that's importance that Yang, whether consciously or unconsciously, gave to these moments.
Absolutely. You only get to choose 3 seconds from the day that you get to remember. Like, that's powerful.
Right. And he, there's the moment where he's like taking a picture of them and they're like, come on over. And it's like, bookended in the film. And we get his perspective. We get to see Jake looking at Yang at the end, and you can see him set up the frame and then stand up a little bit and look at the family, and you can tell he's taking the memory in that moment.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah, so we get the relationship that he had with Ada, which I think like shows again like a sort of humanity and something that speaks to like our human experience, and it's like a secret romance that also makes me think that he kind of realized that it's not something that he should have been doing necessarily.
Well,
I don't
we don't
really know
understand
why.
the nature of that love he seems to feel.
Yeah.
Like, we interpret it. We watch these moments, and it looks to me like a romantic love, and I think Jake interprets it that way. But is it something else? Because once we reveal why there's this connection to Ada, but like watching her sleep and stuff, like, it felt like a romantic love. But again, is that just the Turing test? Is that just us being fooled?
Well, and I love the conversation in the car with Ada where he says like, I can't remember I wish I could remember the exact words, but she says like, that's such a human, because she's a clone and he is an AI entity.
The question is, did Yang want to be a person?
Right.
And she's like, that's such a human thing to ask, like to assume that other beings want to be people.
And that was profound to me, because I thought like that is how the threshold we're going to get to is our perspectives might not go, or the majority of human beings' perspectives might not go far enough to actually understand what it means for these entities to be alive in a way. You know, it's a different walk of life.
Sure. Yeah. We might be the ones who fall short eventually.
Yeah.
No, and that's a great question. And then I love that there's this whole like subplot of clones and their status, because it seems that, like, I don't know, it's interesting that there are no children in this movie or story that are the biological offspring of the parents, right? We have an adopted child, and then we have the clones, and it seems like cloning has become the hot thing.
I think the implication is that there's some infertility in the future.
Maybe, but it's never said.
It's not said.
It also could be a choice, right? Like it could, maybe he's proposing, Weinstein, that is, that people, when given the choice, start to actually go for the cloning idea of like.
I kept thinking about like what it meant, what psychologically it would do to a child if they knew that you were a clone, and what that means to be like exactly the same as your parent, and like what the expectations.
You know what this really gets into, though, right? Nature and nurture.
Yeah.
Because of course they're different people, and like the daughter, I think, points that out. Like, you can clone somebody, but if they as soon as they experience life in a different way, they're going to go on a different path, and they're going to become different people. And we're going to see, it's much like the identical twin scenario, because ultimately you're just an identical twin. If cloning, my understanding of it, and maybe I'm wrong in this, scientists may disagree, but my understanding is that a perfect clone would be much like a identical twin.
I always assumed it would be, because even identical twins have some small variations.
But I thought that variation all came from, if they're truly identical, I thought the variations only came from upbringing. But like biologically, they're identical.
I'm not sure.
At least they begin identical. I'm not sure either. I guess that's a question for a biologist, I guess.
Yeah.
But I don't know. It's fascinating, right? And like ultimately, this is about the difference in experience and like living in a different time and in a different situation, and how these clones are all like, we're not the people we were. We're different people. And that's like that could be its whole story itself, right? Like the nature of these clones. You could have a whole story about the clone neighbor. But instead, it's just kind of going on separate. Now, there's a really fascinating part that I want to touch on before we leave it. There's this conversation about the grafting of the tree. And I love that moment from Yang explaining to Mika about being adopted. And then we also get the conversation with the wife about what it means to be alive, and if there's anything that happens after, and like how there's the point of no return when the caterpillar essentially dies and then transforms into the butterfly, and how for the caterpillar that's the end, but then it's also for everybody else a new beginning, and the impossibility of knowing.
And Yang makes a point to say like, I don't care if there is nothing after this as well. And he's like, I don't know if I've been programmed that way.
Yeah, and that was profound too. I think I had that exact line I wrote down. He said, because he said, there's no something without nothing. And I really like that too. That's something that, you know, as someone who is agnostic, something I think about a lot, right? Like, would I want to die at some point if I was given the option to live forever? And what is the value in death? And I think this is just highlighting like meaning is granted to life by the fact that it ends, right? Like by the fact that there is a time limit on it. And that's kind of what he's touching on here, I think. And that's why he's like, I'm okay with the ending, because if it doesn't end, then none of this means anything.
Yeah, I mean, and so the story ends in a similar kind of way, but we get that big twist where we get to see the Ada relationship and all of his memories. And then
But what's different about it, the ending, we don't get the funeral, we don't get the voice box, and instead we get the decision to donate the memories to the museum, but not the body. He doesn't, so that he's not on display. And I got the implication there was going to be some sort of funeral. We just don't see it. The neighbors' relationship is not as prominent here. It does seem like there's like a moment where we feel that George, or maybe his name's Russ in the movie, I'm not sure, is more than he seems to be, and actually genuinely wants to be like a friend of Jake. But it's not as prominent as it is in the story. So there are some changes here, and I think ultimately it shifts the focus of the story a little bit. If I may, I think Yang's personhood, if you were to talk about the scales of Yang as a person versus not a person, in the story, I feel like the scales are more level. In the movie, I think the thumb is firmly pressed on Yang as a person. And that's what the effect of the memories are for us. That's what the effect of the decisions we see Yang make, and the extrapolations and the feelings that Yang expresses. All of that, to me, got to the point where at the end, I was fully convinced. Like, yeah, of course Yang's a person. And that changes what this movie's about, ultimately. Because if Yang's now a person, it's more about how he was dealt with, the ethics of his situation. And you can also start to make it more about the metaphor of being Asian and being Asian American and disconnect from culture. There's so many other things that it opens the door to, but it does shift the question a little bit away from is Yang ultimately a person, which I think the story is more undecided, and in fact ends on a place of acceptance of I don't know.
One of the major things that happens here at the end too that I think solidifies all of this is that in the memories we keep hearing this song, and it's like in the club, and then I think he's singing it. Yang is singing it at one point, and those are in previous lives of his. And then at the end we hear Mika singing that song. So there is that bleed from his former life to know the song, or at least connect with the song, and then teach it to Mika. He
has a legacy. His life mattered. That's something that Jake says. And we see that it mattered to Mika. We see that it mattered to Jake. I thought Kyra, I would have liked to see a little more from her perspective. Like, I saw her engaging in that conversation, but I was unclear on whether or not that completely changed her mind about it. I guess I assumed it did. Because she was also very cold throughout and seemed the least caring about Yang.
I think she also, I think she was more worried about her daughter than she was about Yang and what this was doing to her daughter.
And I did like the story, the movie, proposes like, hey, maybe we need to be the ones who take more of an active role in our daughter's life and connecting her to her, her culture, and not offload this onto someone else. Yeah. And I thought that was a great point, right? Like a great like owning up of like, yeah, this is kind of an abdication of responsibility here a little bit. But I do also love the idea of like Jake kind of considering Yang a son. And it's such a sweet moment when he talks about the family business and passing it on to him. But I was unclear on whether or not Yang can actually taste. I got the implication that he can't. Seemed like he drank it and mimicked, but ultimately isn't tasting. And it's interesting that decision is made, because there's nothing, if a computer can see and a computer can't hear, there's nothing inherently that stops a computer from being able to taste and to touch and to smell. These are all senses that are converted into electrical signals for our brains. So we're already starting to break through this barrier in our technology. So yeah, it's more difficult, but to me, like, if Yang could taste and could smell and could do all these other things, does that change the equation fundamentally?
Yeah, I think another thing with that is all of us experience those sensations differently. And so to program that into a robot is to say, or into an AI is to say, like, figure out what this tastes like or what this smells like to you. And that's like, you know, that gets that weird free will thing where it's like, is this why do we perceive things differently? Why is it not just this tastes like strawberries? You know, why do we taste strawberries differently?
Well, you're talking about the sort of subjectivity of reality and how none of us perceive reality the same way. And the question of, I mean, this gets down to the idea of like the brain in the jar. Like, how do we know that reality is real and that it's all not just a hallucination? It's all not just a dream. Reality could just be a dream that we're experiencing as a brain in a jar.
Yeah.
There's nothing that says that for sure isn't happening.
Yeah. I mean, I think unless you have anything else, that's a good place to leave it, because like a lot of things I think are still unexplained. And I love that about a story like this, right? Like let's just walk away and say, not sure.
Embrace the not knowing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
All right. I'll go first if you're cool with that on
Sure.
my pick. I'm going to take the film here, and I'm going to take it for the reasons that I think Kogonada is a really fascinating filmmaker. He's doing things that not many can or would be doing in the space. I love how he interpreted the story. I think the story seed obviously needs to get the credit. The source material needs the credit for what a great premise it was. Like I said, it's just exploring it in a way, exploring AI and what it means to be alive in a way that I haven't seen a lot of AI stories do, in a very like possible way, like we talked about, like something that feels possible and tangible in the future. But the performances, the way that it all came together, the way that it is very melancholy, and it like, this is one of those films that I'll be thinking about for a long time. I'll think back to a scene and be able to sort of relive it. It's a film that I'd like to watch again because it feels like it's pretty rich with that sort of just a lot of things that I didn't pick up on, like this idea of like the war, like rewatching it, having thought about this is like a post-war America, it seems, after they've tried to make some strives towards like environmentalism and being more progressive as a society.
I keep thinking of that phrase, this is the future liberals want. There was like a meme, but like it kind of is true for this. This feels
kind
like
of is, yeah. And then it's just showing like still the cracks in that idea of like,
sure, there's still problems.
There's still problems, and there's always going to be human problems that we have to deal with as families and society, and I think things will just get more complicated, but ultimately, like, there's a balancing act that happens as things are added to our lives. I think we gain things and we lose things. So I think this idea of Yang being able to help in a way and become a part of the family is really fascinating to think about, and the way that you can sort of, again, like I think of it as like my dog is a part of my family, right? Like I've
right.
helped. We bought this entity that we have in the home and we take care of and helps us emotionally and all of these things. And I know the pet analogy to what could be seen as a being, as a human being, mm-hmm. is a little weird, but that's fraught. Like sort of the idea of like when you lose a pet, it's the same kind of void as if you lost a human being. Yep. And that kind of stuff, it really fascinates me. And overall, I just think Kogonada made this beautiful film, and I'm going to be watching whatever he comes out with in the future.
Okay, so for me, I started out reading the story going like, oh, that was cool. It asked a bunch of big questions that I'm left thinking of. It didn't sort of grip me in the way that like some of my most beloved short stories do. Like I wasn't like, oh, this is one of the best short stories I've ever read. It was good. But yeah, it didn't quite rise to that level. And then I came into the movie thinking like this movie is going to absolutely blow it out, right? Like, it's going to be a no contest, because this movie has the chance to expand on all of these really interesting ideas and do something beautiful with them. It's an A24 film, so I was very excited. And ultimately, I really liked the movie, and I think it does all of the things you just described, all the things you just talked about. It made me want like go back to the story in my mind a lot, though, and think about all the things that I maybe wasn't giving Weinstein full credit for, like how many interesting topics he's dealing with. And I liked the ambiguity that the story had that the movie sort of shifts away from. So it kind of came back down, and they came closer together in my mind, and it became more of a question of like, which one of these ultimately do I think is best? ultimately I did decide the movie is where it's at for me. And it's because of a few scenes. It's because of the tea scene. It's because of the butterfly scene, the montages. There are a few things that just really sort of elevate the movie into another zone, another tier, I guess. And the added layers of what it means to be Asian American, sort of to be an immigrant or be adopted, to belong. It added a lot of rich texture to the story that I really appreciated, even as we moved away from the ambiguity of the original piece. So ultimately, yeah, I agree with you. I'm going to give it to the movie. I absolutely am going to be really interested to see anything else this filmmaker makes, but this was a fun one, and I love the conversation we were able to have about it. I love this stuff, and again, I'll just say, if you like this, please consider reading my story, What Good is a Sad Backhoe, in Reckoning 6, which actually is going to become free to read in about a month. So if you follow me on Twitter or whatever, I'll definitely post about it. Right now, you have to pay to get the ebook, I think, is the only way to read it. So, but it'll be free soon. And yeah, because I think I talk a lot about these same kind of topics, and yet I approach it from a slightly different perspective, because the AI in question in my story is a giant digging machine that is not human-like in the way that Yang is. And I delve into like the differences that can create. So if that sounds interesting to you, man, this was a good one. I'm glad that we got to do this really introspective, thoughtful film and piece, because we're going to change directions here a little bit. And I guess I'll reveal that at the very end of the episode, what our next project's going to be. So stick around for that. If you enjoyed this discussion and our debate about artificial intelligence and what it means to be alive, please let us know in the form of a rating and review on whatever app you chose to listen on. Mention this episode and let us know what you thought. We'd love to hear from you in that way, and it helps get the word out to more potential listeners.
Yeah, and be sure to connect with us on social media as well. Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, TikTok, all of the platforms, at Ink to Film on all of those. It's a good way to see what we have coming up next, and also, send us messages if you like our stuff and if you're interested in hearing us talk about a specific story.
Yeah, if you also love this stuff the way we just talked about, like we want to talk with you about it. I love engaging with people who share our love for these mediums. Also, you can support us on Patreon, and in return, you would get access to a bunch of bonus episodes where we talk about alternate adaptations and other things, other experimental things that we've tried. What was our most recent one we just did? Was that Jodorowsky's Dune, or did we do one after that?
No, it was The Sandman, and we talked about House of the Dragon.
Oh, we talked about the bonus episodes of Sandman that we hadn't gotten our original coverage. So if that sounds interesting to you, check out our Patreon. We also have merch on there, like a mug and shirt and stuff like that, with alternate artwork. So we'd love to have your support.
And thank you to Ross Bugden for the use of our intro and outro music.
All right, so the only thing left to do is to announce our next project. We are returning to Middle-earth, so to what is likely to be the last time, for a 4-episode extravaganza on The Hobbit. We're going to start out by reading the book together, just me and you, and we're going to discuss Tolkien's original novel. And then we're going to dive into the 3 Peter Jackson films, and we're going to try and bring on a different guest each week to sort of help us along the way. And I don't know, I haven't seen them since they originally came out, so I'm interested to see how they hold up.
I'm going to go in with very open expectations. I'm not going to try to be biased. I want to really...
My expectations are very low. I'm going to just admit that.
So I want to be very open. I'm not going to try to bring any baggage. I want to really try to enjoy it and engage with it for what it is. And I'm also going to be doing a lot of background digging to sort of see what went on with the production and everything. So look forward to that.
I'm excited, though. I'm excited to return to Middle-earth. We thought it was a good time because we got the Rings of Power coming out right now, which I've only seen 1 episode of, but I'm going to watch more of, and maybe we can talk about that another time. The only other thing I would say is I know I want to do a bonus episode on the original animated Hobbit adaptation, because I love that, and I know that I want to make you watch it, and I think that I'm going to go ahead and say that's going to be our September bonus episode.
Yeah.
So if you're interested in that, check it out, because we actually will be releasing it probably before we release all the movie episodes, which are going to spill into October. But I think we should watch it early on. So I'm down for it, because it's going to be really fascinating to touch on throughout our coverage. Anyway, I'm excited for this. Hopefully you are too. And until next time,
keep adapting.